Welcome to Commander Central, episode 198. And today we'll be taking a look at listener Taylor Thiessen's Kruphix God of Horizons Hydra deck. I'm Dana.
And I'm Max.
Max, welcome back to the show. How's it going, man?
Doing very good. We're recording on a Monday over lunch. So
yes.
How was your weekend, Dana?
Weekend was pretty decent. We got to play some Commander.
We did. I got to play Commander for the first time in 2 months.
Yeah, it's been a while for sure.
Yeah.
So we fired up some games on what would have been Saturday night with myself, you, listener Dan Kraus, and a friend of ours locally named Lucas.
Yes.
So we had 4 players, and we played, what did we play, 3 games, I think?
I think we did 2, we got 2 games in with Lucas, and then we had 1 more game with just us 3.
Okay, yep, that's right. And, you know, there's always a few challenges playing, like, on webcam, but I thought everything went pretty smoothly, and it was just nice to get to play again.
Yeah, it was very nice to play. I remember how to play, so that's a big bonus for me as a content creator who doesn't typically do, like, Arena, so
yeah,
it was a lot of fun, and I think it'll probably become a weekly thing.
Cool. Well, we did, so this is going to air on Thursday, and actually the plan is to maybe play some more games on Wednesday night, so the night before this airs with Matt and Joey for DDH Recast, so hopefully we'll have one of those we can actually post to YouTube as well.
Sweet.
So with you and I and those two, so half of Commander Central and all DDH Recast all on one show.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. So yeah, we'll have some more games coming up. We can hopefully have something interesting to talk about there, and definitely some that we can put online for viewers to check out. So I'm excited for that as well. I don't think we have anything new news-wise or anything. I actually just saw something this morning that they're phasing out Planeswalker points and the website that keeps track of them. But it's been years since I've even looked to check on the status of my Planeswalker points. I'm not sure.
I don't.
So, I mean, I'm sure that is the kind of thing that does matter to some people, but...
The biggest complaint I've been seeing is people just want their records
yes.
still hosted somewhere. You know, it keeps track of every event you've ever played in that you registered with DCI, and, you know, so that's going away, and people just want somewhere to store that info, or a good way to save it in, like, a CSV or something.
And that is kind of neat to be able to go back and look like, did I play? How many events did I play in, 2014 or whatever it is?
Right.
So, like, that is kind of cool to be able to check that out, even if I don't ever really do it. So aside from that, though, we're kind of in the lull. We got blasted with 2 sets right consecutively, and now I don't think we have much going on until Core Set, really, do we?
No, I mean, we're still waiting for Ikoria and Commander to release, but...
Yeah, I guess we have all the spoilers, but the cards aren't actually out, so...
But yeah...
Yeah, that's interesting, because we usually don't have this long of a lag in between seeing cards and actually getting to play with them.
Right, this is very unusual, but, we understand the circumstances, so...
Yeah, so proxy a few up and you can give them a test, I guess. That's better than nothing for now.
Right.
Well, if you out there in listener land want to reach out to us and talk about any Ikoria cards or Commander 2020 cards you're proxying up and testing, or let us know how your online games are going if you got some in, how'd you do that, Max?
You can head over to Twitter and find us at CMDR Central. You can Facebook search us CMDR Central. And you can find us on YouTube by searching CMDR Central.
You can also find us on patreon.com.
Yeah, patreon.com/CMDR Central. Head over, check out our rewards. If you are able to support us financially, we are eternally grateful to everybody who can and currently does. And one of those rewards is the Decks You Play series, like we're talking about today.
Absolutely. You can get one of these on where we talk about your Kruphix God of Horizons Hydra deck, assuming that's what you have. So speaking of Kruphix God of Horizons deck, should we talk about it here, Max?
Let's do it.
So what is Taylor's meta like?
Taylor's meta is mixed and ranges from upgraded precons to highly focused and optimized CEDH pods. However, the vast majority of the meta consists of decks tuned in the 5 to 6 range. Playstyles consist of creature beats, mill, control, and everything in between. Combo isn't too prevalent, but when it does appear, it's the scumbag stuff, so, I'm all for that. Board wipes and targeted removal run amok, and they are usually exile-based, as graveyards are utilized very frequently among many of the decks played.
Okay. We always ask what the goal of the deck is, and Taylor says the goal of the Kruphix deck is not the typical combo and race to the bottom to the lab man win. Taylor went for the big stompy Hydra deck with many forms of +1/+1 counter acceleration, a few overrun effects which have already been cut, and additional forms of evasion to punch damage through at any point. So with a couple of alternate win conditions to close out some longer games, Taylor tends to focus on pouring as much Kruphix banked mana into Hydras and growth acceleration as possible, and other impactful game-winning creatures to stomp out his opponents.
So we always ask what the weaknesses are, the areas of the deck they would like us to focus on. Taylor says the weaknesses for this deck are they struggle to get enough land early game to really take off, and they get landlocked with creatures they can't quite afford to cast at the time in the early game. They find deck building is difficult to make creature cuts earlier in the game for ramp and support cards.
And what is the budget for a single card or upgrades? And Taylor says around $100 just to keep options open. That's very easy to hit. So let's just jump into this deck. What do you say, Max?
Let's do it.
All right, so Kruphix I will read first. Kruphix, God of Horizons, 3 and a Simic, 5 mana total for a 4/7 legendary enchantment creature god. Kruphix has indestructible, like all the gods do on Theros. As long as your devotion to green or blue is less than 7, Kruphix isn't a creature. You have no maximum hand size, which is always useful, and if unused mana would empty from your mana pool, that mana becomes colorless instead. And obviously doesn't empty from your mana pool. So Kruphix lets you basically not lose mana in between steps and phases. Extra hand size, it's a beater, does some kind of Simic-y things there, so it's generally a useful card, but it's also not the kind of commander that's probably going to be dealing commander damage very frequently for wins. So let's take a look at the land base. Max, what do we have here?
So there are currently 34 lands in the deck list. Architect says 35 because it's slotting Growing Rites of Itlimoc into the land slot. I think that is a known bug they're working on fixing.
Yes, indeed.
So there's only 34 lands in this 2-color deck, which, I mean, I run a lot of 2-color decks, and I think 34 is pretty low. I mean, yes, you're in green, and you have access to ramp and card draw with blue. I still think 34 is really low. When I was looking at the deck, I did about 25 test hands, and majority of the time I was only drawing 2 lands most of the time in my opening hand with this deck.
Well, and you're combining the lean amount of lands in a deck with a deck that has an average CMC of 3.8.
Yes.
So, I mean, like, you can get away with that, I think, to a degree in some decks. You know, CEDH decks a lot of times are running, 32 lands or less in some cases because they've got a ton of 0 and 1 drops, and they oftentimes only need 1 or 2 lands to start things off at the very least. And if they don't draw that third one for a couple turns, they will be okay, or they have a ton of filtering effects or, mana rocks, whatever, so they can survive. That isn't really the case here. There's a few mana dorks and there's a few relatively cheap mana rocks, but it's not what you usually see in a deck that only has 34 lands. Myself, I don't think I would be very comfortable playing this deck with that few lands. I think I would definitely bump up to 36 or 37, probably 36, but I think it needs more.
As for specific lands, this land base isn't very diverse. There's, your duals in these colors, so your Breeding Pool and your Hinterland Harbor and your Avamaya Coast and Temple of Mystery. There's a couple of utility lands like Rogue's Passage to help get some of these creatures through. Oran Reef Vastwood, which is you can put a +1/+1 counter on creatures that entered this turn. We have the Novesian Heart of Progress from Dissension, I think.
I believe so, yeah.
And that you can pay Simic and tap it to put a +1/+1 counter on each creature that came into play this turn. And then just a good chunk of basics.
So there are 24 basics in this deck, which is a lot. That's not bad, and I'm never going to tell someone to run less basics, I guess, necessarily. In a 2-color deck, you can definitely afford to run more dual lands. There's a lot of things in this deck that require multiple different color mana. I mean, and I've seen, worse, but I think that you are very, very safe with with 24 basics, dropping out 5 of them into dual lands or something, and you're still going to have more basics than most people at the table.
Yeah, totally.
And, some of the dual options that you could be running here aren't, super cheap. Botanical Sanctum, I think, runs about $10. That's the fast land that was in Kaladesh. There is a Breeding Pool in here. You did mention that. Flooded Grove is the filter land that was in the original Lorwyn set, that runs $12 or $14. It's not cheap either, but it would give you one more dual land that you can run to make sure you hit both your colors. There is a Hinterland Harbor here. That one's pretty efficient, which is nice to see. Waterlogged Grove is the land from Modern Horizons that you can sacrifice to draw a card. Might be kind of useful here. And it's only $6. It's not crazy expensive. That's fairly reasonable, I think. And, yes, it's a 2-color deck, and maybe you don't need the fixing that you get from something like Prismatic Vista. It probably wouldn't hurt to add a few more of those. There's no command tower in here.
Yeah, which, maybe they don't have one.
Right.
But, outside of monocolor, I love my command tower.
Yeah, I would add a command tower for sure. Just, this land base could be cleaned up without spending too much money, and it would just make your life easier. Like, land base makes life easier.
And doing these minor improvements isn't going to make this deck go from, the 5 or 6 range to the 8 or 9 range. It's going to keep it in that range because it's just making sure you can cast your spells throughout the game.
It's the kind of thing that you notice and no one else notices.
Right. Like,
you notice how much easier it is to get your stuff done, but nobody else feels like, for the most part, your deck has gotten that much more powerful. That might not be true, like, if you're playing 5-color Ur-Dragon and you have the perfect ABUR dual mana base, then yes, that's obvious to everybody else, but like in this kind of deck, it's just going to be a quality of life improvement kind of situation. And speaking of basics and having room to pull a few things out, we mentioned a couple duels that you could add in relatively inexpensively, but land removal lands, there's no land removal lands here.
Yeah, Ghost Quarter, Field of Ruin, Tectonic Edge, those are all fairly inexpensive, and you could easily swap out a few basics just for those, and they're going to produce colorless mana that you can put into your X spells later in the game.
And, maybe you don't see Gaia's Cradle or you don't see Sarah's Sanctum, and I get that. Like, we don't see very many Gaia's Cradles. I see it on occasion, but, like, I don't see it that much. But there's a lot of players out there who have been playing since original Theros block that are running Nykthos, and Nykthos is a crazy strong card. Cabal Coffers is $50, but, like, people still run Cabal Coffers. Cabal Stronghold in a mono black deck is a really good card. Valkut in a mono red deck is a really dangerous card to have out. So there's just almost always a reason to have a land removal land. Like, looking at this deck, if I'm playing against this deck and Rogue's Passage is in play, and there's a 25/25 Hydra, I don't want that Rogue's Passage out.
No.
So in almost any situation, there's going to be something worth removing with a land removal land. And I know we beat on the Scavenger Grounds drum a lot. But there's almost always something worth scavenger grounding. So that would be one I would find room for too. You could very easily add a few of these duels, add the land removal lands, add scavenger grounds, and still be running 18 basics, which is perfectly fine. Any of these utility lands in here you don't like, Max?
I'm not a big fan of the 2 that put a +1/+1 counter on each creature or each green creature that enters the battlefield this turn. We'll get into this into the creature section, but this doesn't have a lot of Hydras in the deck.
Yes.
So the way I kind of did this deck tech is I kind of pushed it towards more Hydras to be able to really use all that mana you're probably going to be storing in Kruphix.
Yep.
So with that said, I don't see a Hydra deck dropping 3 or 4 Hydras each turn. They're going to drop maybe 1, maybe 2, and I would much rather use this mana to produce the colored mana versus, save it to activate it to put an extra counter on a Hydra that's probably, 6/6, 10/10, whatever it's going to be when it hits that battlefield.
Well, especially in the case of Novagen, where it has an activation cost of 2. So, counting itself, that's 3 mana it's being used to put a counter on each creature that came into play this turn. The odds of you casting a creature and having the mana free to use Novagen seem pretty low. And at most, it's probably going to be 1 creature. There are definitely some decks where, it's running tokens, and Novagen may be a little bit better because it's ETB, it's not on cast, but still I feel like Novagen probably doesn't get the job done very often. At least Aran Reef taps for green, and it doesn't require activation costs, so you can just put a counter on something when it comes into play.
Yeah, for sure.
I think that one's has a little more upside, but I feel like Novagen is just the kind of card that you're just not going to use.
Yep, and Taylor is running the third one, Ruins of Oran Reef, from the second Battle for Zendikar set.
Yes.
I don't even remember. Oathbreaker?
Oath of the Gatewatch, I believe.
One, there we go. Got there. This one is probably the least powerful out of the 3 of them because it enters tapped, only makes colorless mana, and it only puts the counters on colorless creatures that entered the battlefield this turn.
And I believe there's 5 of them in this deck?
There are 5 different colorless creatures, yes.
So the odds of that doing anything, and they're not really creatures that, like, are that much more powerful. Hangerback Walker is the exception, but the rest are all Eldrazi, and they don't really care if they get a +1 counter on them. Like, they're not stronger because of the counter. I mean, they're stronger because they have a +1 counter, but it doesn't add any utility to it like it does Hangerback Walker. I agree, that one doesn't do much for me either, and I don't think I would run it. One I might add in here, it's not the flashiest land in the world, but I do run it in my Crash deck that does care about +1 counters, and that is Llanowar Reborn. It ETB's tapped, which is never ideal, but you can tap it for a green mana, so that's almost always useful, and it has Graft 1, so basically the land comes into play with a +1 counter on it, and whenever a creature ETBs under your control, you can move the +1 counter off Llanowar Reborn off onto the creature. So it doesn't cost you anything to use after that, aside from it coming into play tapped. There's no cost to move that counter onto a creature, and, being able to throw that onto your Hangerback Walker, or throw that onto, even your commander, if you have something in play that then interacts with +1 counters just to get things started, is fairly useful. I have liked it in my Crash deck, and I think that's one I would probably consider over Novajin or over the one that does it just to colorless creatures. That is really, I think, all I have for the land base.
Same here.
Okay, why don't we jump over here and take a look at sorceries. That's the next thing we have in our notes for the list. There's 8 sorceries in this deck. They're all green. There's a couple ramp spells: Cultivate, Explosive Vegetation, Rampant Growth. There's a creature tutor in Green Sun Zenith. There's Harvest Season, which lets you ramp out basic lands equal to the number of tapped creatures you control. Overwhelming Stampede and Triumph for the Hordes are ways to win games, and Rishkar's Expertise is just a phenomenal draw spell, especially in a deck where you're probably going to have some pretty big Hydras out. What are your thoughts on this sorcery suite, Max?
I think it needs more 2-mana ramp. So there's Nature's Lore, that goes and gets a forest. Farseek goes and gets anything but a forest. So that's a good way to grab your breeding pool, or either just, an island if you need it.
Yes.
Rampant Growth is good in this deck because it's nice early game ramp. Harvest Season I'm torn on, because the way the deck list is currently, it probably does a lot of attacking. So
yes.
Or tapping stuff down, because there are a handful of mana dorks and stuff in the current list.
Yep.
So I see where Harvest Season is good for the current iteration. If this deck were to shift into more of a Hydra focus, where you probably only have a couple creatures on the battlefield at a time, maybe only 1 or 2 swinging, Harvest Season probably isn't great in that situation.
It's definitely matters very much based on how your deck is currently constructed, for sure.
Right. If this deck were to change into a more Hydra-focused deck, I would swap out Harvest Season for Traverse the Outlands. Traverse the Outlands is a 5-mana, 4 and a green sorcery. You can search your library for up to X basic land cards, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control, and you put those onto the battlefield tapped. So,
I mean, even as it stands right now, I feel like that's probably going to be more consistent than Harvest Season.
Oh, yeah, because even with what's in the deck currently, 5 mana to go get 5 lands off of that Crater Hoof that's in the deck list. Or even just 4, if Kruphix is a creature at the time, that's 4 lands for 5 mana. That's not terrible. So I think this would be the deck where Traverse the Outlands is going to come in handy, especially with the amount of basics in the list.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Explosive Vegetation, just turn it into a Skyshroud Claim. It's the exact same mana cost. They both get 2 lands, but the ones from Skyshroud's Claim, I guess they have to be forests, but this isn't a 3 or 4 color deck where you might want to get something that isn't a forest. You can just go grab your breeding pool, and the option to have the lands come into play tapped. Again, no one's going to really notice that it doesn't feel like your deck got more powerful from somebody else's point of view if you're casting Skyshroud Claim over veggies, but you notice it because those lands come into play untapped, and it lets you still make a play that turn. So being able to cast Skyshroud Claim, say it's turn 4 and you've not ramped at all, and you cast Skyshroud Claim and you go get even just 2 basic forests, that lets you then cast Lightning Greaves, or lets you then cast, Everflowing Chalice for 1 counter on it, or lets you put a mana dork into play. It lets you do something with the mana immediately, and that feels really, really good.
Yeah, for sure. Worst case, once the card releases, you could swap that Explosive Veggies out for the Migrations Path. Same card, it just has cycling on it.
Yes. Right, worst case scenario, I would make that change.
Yes.
Because there's that's pure upside and there's no difference, at least with Explosive Vegetation versus Skyshroud Claim, especially when there's not a ton of duels that have the basic land type. There might be situations where I just need 2 islands and I can't get them with Veggie, where I can't get them with Skyshroud Claim and you can with Veggies, whereas the one on cycling is just strictly better.
Yes.
In every situation. So, yeah. No, that makes sense. I like we said about the 2 mana ramp too. I mean, like, not that Cultivate isn't a perfectly fine card, but I would just rather run Nature's Lore 95% of the time. The land comes into play untapped, and you can get that breeding pool, and that's super useful.
Yeah. I mean, I would still run Cultivate. I don't think I would run, Nature's Lore plus Farseek plus Rampant Growth, Cultivate, and then one more top-heavy ramp spell, whether it's Traverse the Outlands or Skyshroud Claim. Because I think in Dromoka, I run every 2 mana one I can find, but 3 wishes, and then 2 3-mana ones and a 4-mana spell. So
yeah, and you very, very often, and actually it happened in the games we played on Saturday night, where Dromoka comes out. I'm like, how was Dromoka in play already? So, like, that makes a big difference in that deck, being able to get that commander up that fast.
Yes.
Any other sorceries here?
Again, I'm taking this deck in the Hydra path. More Hydras, more big creatures. So I would prefer to swap out Green Sun Zenith for Finale of Devastation.
So the beauty of Green Sun Zenith is, number one, if you happen to be running Dryad Arbor, you can cast it on turn 1 with X set to 0, and you can go get Dryad Arbor and put it in play, and you can, functionally get a land ramp on turn 1, which is something that you really can do at all outside of that particular play. And you can also on turn 2 use it to go get a, Elvish Mystic, or use Llanowar Elf or whatever, or Mana Dork. But beyond that, it tends to then, it's an X ability, so like you have to dump the mana into it. Outside of those 3 fairly narrow plays, I feel like Finale has so much more upside.
Oh, totally. I mean, X green, and if X is 10 or more, all your creatures get +X and gain haste until end of turn. On top of it, getting a creature card from your library or graveyard where X is its converted mana cost or less.
Yep.
So you don't have to go get a Hydra, because some Hydras have X in their casting cost. That's not going to do you any good, but, go get that Crater Hoof. Spend the extra 2 mana, make it 10, drop Crater Hoof, and just double Crater Hoof your entire table.
I mean, also, you mentioned it in the text, but like being able to dig it out of your graveyard is a big deal. So that's nice about Finale too. It has that flexibility. I think this isn't a deck that's made for speed. This isn't a deck that's trying to do that super fast, get a Llanowar Elf out on turn 1. And if your deck isn't made for speed, then I would lean into what it does well, which is punch people in the nose on turn 8. And that's what Finale Devastation is going to let you do.
For sure.
So lean into your strengths. If you are built to last, then I would plan the deck around that. Green Sun Zenith is for a deck built for speed, and I don't think that's his deck. So I am in agreement there also. I always like Peer's Women a deck. There's a Peer in this deck, and thematically, I guess it's on point. I don't think he's trying to be too concerned about theme, but there's a Peer and Toothy here as well. It's a ramp spell that dings everybody else. Yeah, it's turn 4, but it's always effective.
Yeah.
So that's one I would maybe consider here if you could find a slot for it. Why don't we jump over and take a look at enchantments now?
Okie dokie. So there are currently 8 enchantments in the deck. So we have Asceticism, a good protection spell. Doubling Season, totally makes sense, doubling all those counters on all your creatures. Helix Pinnacle, one of those alternate win cons in the deck, also works great with Doubling Season. Hydra's Growth, which is an aura. When it enters the battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter on the creature it's enchanting. Then at the beginning of your upkeep, double the amount of +1/+1 counters on the enchanted creature. So that's pretty cool. I didn't really even know this card existed until I saw it in this list. We have an Exonerable Tide, which is just a proliferate spell. We have Nyxbloom Ancient, which we'll talk about in the creatures section.
Yep.
Simic Ascendancy, just another alt win con. And the first Iroan Games, a saga from Theros Beyond Death.
So 8 enchantments, but I guess we'll I think for intents and purposes of what we're doing, we're going to move Nyxbloom Ancient over to creature. So really there's 7 enchantments here.
Yes. Well, the Growing Rights would make up, so there is 8.
That's true. Okay, yeah. So that kind of washes it. So we'll talk about Growing Rights here then instead of Nyxbloom Ancient.
There we go.
What do you think of this suite of enchantments?
So, again, this is a good starting point. Doubling Season is a great include. You kind of need that to help beef up your Hydras.
Yep.
Asceticism, I love that card. It's a great way to protect your board and regenerate stuff. The Hydra's Growth as the aura is the one card I'm kind of iffy on. When I'm thinking about the Hydra build I would make this deck into.
Okay.
Getting 2-for-1 on your Hydra doesn't sound great. Granted, it is another Colonian Hydra effect.
Yes. And
that does play into Doubling Season, so that gets out of hand a lot. So I think I've already turned my opinion around on this card.
I think it's a neat card, but I feel like it comes into play and puts a counter on a creature, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you double the counters on enchanted creature. So it takes a full turn to really, you get one counter, but like that's not why it's here. You're here for the doubling ability. It takes a full turn for that to happen, whereas something like at instant speed, Solidarity Heroes for 2 mana, choose any number of target creatures and double the +1 counters on them. It has Strive, so it's 1 green for each target beyond the first. So for 2 mana, you just can double the counters, just full stop, every single time without having to wait a full turn. You're not really getting 2 for 1. I mean, I guess someone can remove the creature in response to you casting it, but that's less likely to have happened than someone removing the creature after it sits there for a full turn with an aura on it, when they can like untap and like, okay, well, that's going to be out of control, so I need to destroy it, versus Solidarity Heroes, where you can do it on mid-swing. Someone's like, okay, that Hydra's only an 8/8, well, I'm just going to take the 8 damage. Boom, it's 16.
Yep.
And do that to multiple creatures. If you have 6 mana free, you can do it to 3 different creatures because of the Strive ability. So while Solidarity of Heroes is over in instance, which we haven't even talked about yet, I feel like for the most part, I would probably just run that over the aura. It's just more consistent.
Fair enough.
Inexorable Tide is a neat card, but it's also 5 mana, and it doesn't do anything when it comes into play until you cast a spell. I think there are decks where that's really, really strong. A Super Friends deck, for example, because the amount of, like, the ability to just for free put loyalty on a Planeswalker changes all the math, and it lets you do things you couldn't otherwise do. I think even in like an Infect deck, when someone's doing the math, I'm like, okay, I'm at 8 poison counters, I'll be fine, for a turn. And then you proliferate them twice, they just die. But I don't think in a deck built with a bunch of creatures that you're hoping to put 12 counters on, I don't think going to 13 is that important, especially for 5 mana.
For sure. And I think this also goes back to kind of what I said earlier about Harvest Season. This isn't something where you're going to be casting a lot of stuff every turn.
Yes.
You're going to cast 1 or 2 spells a turn. So I kind of agree with what you're saying. I think for 5 mana, it doesn't really do anything unless you do more on top of it. It's going to get removed by the time you take full advantage of it.
And over under the lands, I did mention Llanowar Reborn, which puts a single counter on creatures as a suggested add, but there's almost no opportunity cost paid for that. It's a land. Like, it's just a free +1 counter, whereas this is 5 mana and it uses up a card slot. And I just don't, I feel like it's probably just not worth it with the way this deck is built.
Correct.
So that's one I would probably pull out, but I think you have a couple suggestions here of things that you would add.
I do. So my first suggestion has to do with the Hydra thing, and that's Unbound Flourishing. This was from Modern Horizons, and it's an enchantment for 2 and a green. Whenever you cast a permanent spell with a mana cost that contains X, double the value of X. So that's already huge. Now throw a doubling season on top of that, boom, you're just set.
Yep.
Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell or activate an ability, if that spell's mana cost or that ability's activation cost has X in it, copy that spell or ability and choose new targets for the copy. So this is where you might be able to add like a Blue Sun Zenith or a Stroke of Genius to help with the draw, or just, those would be my first 2 I would think about, but it's mainly for the creatures, doubling that X value on all those Hydras that have X in their casting cost, or X for your Hangerback Walker, stuff like that.
Yeah, I like that.
Something I like to run along with Doubling Season is Hardened Scales. So whenever a creature comes in with a +1/+1 counter, give it an additional 1. So it does a thing like Peer, but only for creatures.
And I think the difference here, again, between this and Inexorable Tide is it's 1 mana.
Yeah, Hardened Scales is that card in almost any deck I see it played in. I don't really worry about it. It's always one of those cards that by the time it's done its damage, it's too late and it's not worth my removal spell. And
it doesn't really need to put many extra counters on many creatures to pay for itself.
Right.
And it's also one of those things, like, if there's things that put multiple counters on a thing, you get a trigger each time, too.
Yes.
So, again, like, I don't like Inexorable Tide for the reasons I mentioned, but I think things like Hardened Scales and Llanowar Reborn are just so efficient that they make up for it in a way that Tide doesn't.
My final suggestion would be Hadana's Climb.
It's such a good card.
This is the flip enchantment from Ixalan, or Rivals of Ixalan. At the beginning of combat on your turn, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. If that creature has 3 or more +1/+1 counters on it, transform Hadana's Climb into the Winged Temple of Orazka. And it can tap for any color, or you can pay 1 and Simic. and tap it to give target creature you control gains flying and gains +X/+X, where X is its power. So it's kind of like an overwhelming stampede. It doesn't give trample, but you're pumping that Hydra up in the air. You're giving it some winged boots or something. This is huge because most of your Hydras are going to have 3 counters on them already, even if you only cast them for 3. So this is something you can cast in your first main phase. If you have a target out, it's going to flip right away.
Yeah.
So maybe you won't have the mana to activate it right after it flips, but you will definitely be able to going forward every turn.
Mm-hmm.
This is a powerhouse in a deck like this, and it gives a way to give evasion to the big Hydras that maybe don't have trample, because not all Hydras have trample.
Right. One last card you have written down here, Max, and I don't know, I think you had it as a possible Nyxbloom Ancient replacement. I like the card a lot, but I do think Nyxbloom Ancient is pretty solid in this deck as well. But Zendikar Resurgent lets you tap your lands for an extra mana, and I think that's why you had it kind of comparable to Nyxbloom Ancient.
Yep.
I think this is a very mana-hungry deck, and it has plenty of sinks for that mana on a lot of these bodies. But there's 33 creatures in this deck, and even if you pair a few of them away to do other things, there's still a lot of bodies here, and being able to draw cards off all those bodies in addition to doubling your mana seems pretty good. If I was looking to swap something out for Inexorable Tide, it would probably be replacing that with Zendikar Resurgent.
Yeah, for sure. I think my notes on Nyxbloom Ancient said it's just a super hot target, so there might just be a chance that you drop Nyxbloom, it gets removed right away, so you have to tap your mana in response. It dies, but that Zendikar Resurgent isn't going to be that hot of a target. Yeah, it will probably get removed over time, but not immediately like a Nyxbloom would.
Yes. Yeah, I think that makes sense. And Nyxbloom is also one of those things, like there's some spells where you cast and you're like, this is going to get removed right away, but if it only costs you 3 mana, maybe it's worth trading it for a removal spell. Nyxbloom Ancient feels bad trading that for, a 2 mana removal spell.
Right.
One more enchantment I might suggest here if the deck stays similar to how it is right now in terms of having this many creatures. Lurking Predators is 4 green. Whenever an opponent casts a spell, reveal the top card of your library, and if it's a creature card, put it onto the battlefield. So when 1/3 of your deck is creatures, and you're playing 3 opponents, all of whom are probably going to be casting at least 1 spell on their respective turns, particularly when you are at the point in the game where you have enough mana to cast Lurking Predators. 1 in 3 players and 1 in 3 cards means you're basically going to get a free creature off Lurking Predators every trip around the board. And that's kind of worst case scenario. The more spells they cast, the longer the game goes, the more free stuff you're going to get. Even without top deck manipulation, I think Lurking Predators with this many creatures in a deck is pretty solid. It's a fun card. You can get a lot of free things off it. If someone happens to be playing the deck that casts, like my Talran deck, for example, that oftentimes, will cast 5 or 6 spells in a single turn, so much gas. It's a relatively inexpensive card. It's only like $1 or so. It's one I would consider trying out if you can put your hands on it. It is a lot of fun to play, and this would be a decent deck for it. The downside here is X cost Hydras or things like Hangback Walker will just die because they'll come into play with no counters on them. But as we mentioned before, this deck doesn't have that many. I mean, it has Hydras in it, but it's not like it's running, 22 Hydras. So depending on what way you go, it's one you could look at as well. All right, Max, what should we look at next here?
Should we move over to the Planeswalkers?
I think so. Might as well.
So there are 3 of them. Kiora, Master of Depths, Nissa, Voice of Zendikar, and Nissa, Who Shakes the World. I have a super hot take.
Okay.
I would take them all out.
I kind of don't disagree. Nissa, Who Shakes the World does double the cost of forests, but one of the things we've suggested is maybe taking a few of those forests out. I would probably take out all 3 of them too.
Yeah.
They don't offer any real specific synergy with this deck.
No, I mean, so Voice of Zendikar for her -2 ability puts a +1/+1 creature on each counter on each creature you control, but that's a single counter.
Right. Again, and the opportunity cost is much higher on this than it is in like hard scales.
Yep. Kiora, probably either the +1 to untap a creature and a land, or the -2 to reveal the top 4 cards of your library and put a creature card into your hand, a creature and or a land card from among them into your hand, and put the rest in the graveyard. And then, like you said, Shakes the World, just doubles the forest.
And none of these are bad or anything. For the most part, almost every Planeswalker card they've printed in the last 5 or 6 years are almost always fine. And any deck that can run them, they're almost always going to generate some level of value.
Yeah.
But they just don't, I don't think, synergize with your deck well enough to make them particularly interesting. I mean, maybe it's personal preference, but like things that are really synergistic in decks for me are super, super fun when you play this one thing and it like causes 3 powerful things to happen because your deck cares about what it's doing. I really enjoy doing that. And it's also effective. None of these really cause that kind of reaction when you play them. They are perfectly fine, but they're just not splashy or flashy or that interesting. So I kind of agree. I would take them all.
So I guess that means we move on to the instance.
Right. That's simple. We don't love the Planeswalker. And you know what? It's one of those things. I've absolutely in the past cracked open a Planeswalker from a booster pack. But like, I just want to run this because I like it. I get that totally. I'm not saying none of these are a mistake. They're all perfectly effective cards. And if you like them because you're a fan of Nissa or Kiora, do it up.
Right.
All right. What are we looking at next?
Instance.
Instance in this deck. There are currently 4. There's an Aether Spouts, a Beast Within, a Bioshift, and a Cyclonic Rift. So Cyclonic Rift, you're playing blue. If you own one and you're playing blue, you might as well play it until the point when they tell us we can't play it anymore.
Especially with Kruphix, because all that colorless mana just sits there.
Yep. Way easier to cast in this deck.
For sure.
You know, Beast Within is a premier removal spell because it hits any single target at all. I've always liked Aether Spouts because it gives you a combat trick and a way to mass bounce a bunch of stuff. And it's super annoying because they have to either bury the creatures in the bottom of their library or put them on top and draw no gas but creatures. It's a really effective spell. Bioshift is a little more obscure because it was a common from, I think, Return to Ravnica. Move any number of +1 counters from target creature onto another target creature with the same controller. What are your thoughts here? What do you think about Bioshift? Is that a strong enough effect to have in a deck?
I think Bioshift is really a defensive card. So you're going to move, if someone tries to remove a Hydro that's, has 20 counters on it,
sure,
you can cast this, move those counters over to something else that you can go ahead and swing with, and then, the Hydra probably dies because it was a 0/0, and then their removal spell fizzles as well. I don't know how else I would use this card.
And then I would say if that's how you're using it, then I would just run something like a Swan Song or a counterspell and stop them from doing that in the first place, as well as stop anything else that might be happening aside from just removing your creatures.
For sure. Taylor mentioned there's a lot of spot removal running around in their meta. So, Pongify, Rapid Hybridization, Reality Shift. Those are just the next 3 best removal spells in this color combination.
Yeah.
You mentioned counter spells. I always like to run 1, maybe 2 in my blue decks. I get some people just don't like them. They're not fun to play against. So I get maybe why they aren't running 1, but definitely you mentioned Swan Song or Arcane Denial would be the 2 I would suggest here. And then some draw for this deck. Inspiring Call is a sweet trick that makes any creature with a +1/+1 counter on it indestructible. And then you draw a card, I believe.
Yeah.
I have that
and
backwards.
what's nice about that spell, too, is you don't have to necessarily... it kind of winds up being modular. You can use it to save your stuff from a board wipe. You can use it just for a card draw spell. You can use it for both, but, you don't need to have both of those things be relevant for it to be useful. It can be the end of your turn, and you can just be like, I'm just going to Inspiring Call to draw 3 cards. I don't even care about the Indestructible.
Right.
Or you can use the Indestructible to stop something from being removed and not care if you only draw 1 card. It's just a bonus if you can get big numbers off both, but I think it's a really, really useful card.
Yeah. Otherwise, Return of the Wild Speaker is a great addition from Throne of Eldraine. You're either going to draw a lot of cards off of a Hydra, or you're going to make all your non-humans get +3/+3 until end of turn.
And I don't think there are any humans in this deck.
I don't think... Peer?
No, Eternal Witness. And I guess Peers as well, so there's 2. So the rest of your deck is... And I doubt you're ever using Return of the Wild Speaker on Eternal Witness, or I guess technically maybe you would unpeer, but for the most part, it's just a great card here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think Momentous Fall is a really solid card in this kind of deck. You're not doing graveyard stuff. Like, it feels a little bit better in my Kresh deck, where when I sacrifice a creature to it, the counters get moved on to Kresh. That's not always going to happen here. But, I don't know, it's oftentimes worth losing that 12/12 just to gain 12 life and draw 12 cards. That's fantastic. Even if you're not moving the counters anywhere else, and there's a few things in this deck that will let you do that anyway. So that one's one Momentous Fall, I would definitely consider here as well. Aether Spouts, I'm torn on. I love the card, but there's really nothing else in this deck that's doing that, and you don't have a ton of instant speed spells here either. So, yes, I guess Aether Spouts, the opportunity cost is fairly low because you do have mana available in your mana pool from Kruphix. It's not like going to waste, but you do still have to leave 2 blue up, and I guess you can dump them into Kruphix, tap at the end of turn, and the mana sticks around. So it's not wasteful like it would be in a lot of decks where if you only have 4 instants and you're saving up 5 mana for Aether Spouts, it feels pretty bad if you don't use it. I just feel like, I don't know, it doesn't seem, you've got 33 creatures, like the amount of times you're vulnerable to somebody attacking you feels pretty limited. Does that make sense?
It makes sense.
And this isn't a defensive deck, and I'm not saying you have to be all in on defense, but I don't know if it makes a lot of sense here over something that's going to go on offense.
Gotcha.
I think your defense might be more offense.
Fair enough.
So, just a thought. It's still a super, super good card, and I've gotten destroyed by it, and I've destroyed people, so I'll never tell someone not to run it. I just feel like it's a little bit at odds with what you're doing in this deck.
Yeah.
Should we take a look at artifacts here?
Let's do it.
So there are, right now, 8 artifacts in this deck. Got a Basilisk Collar, which gives creature a Death Touch and a lifelink. Eldrazi Monument gives creatures +1/+1 and flying and indestructible, but you have to sacrifice a creature at the beginning of each upkeep. Everflowing Chalice, which you can pump mana into to put counters on it, and tap it for additional mana. Lightning Greaves, Panharmonicon to double your ETBs, a Simic Signet for ramp along with a Soul Ring, and a Great Henge, which does 14 different things. Any thoughts here on the artifact suite?
The way the deck is currently constructed, I get why Panharmonicon is in the deck. There's a lot of stuff that enters the battlefield and does something which you want to get extra value out of. Great.
Yeah.
In the Hydra build where I would take this deck, I don't think Panharmonicon would make the cut because it doesn't double the amount of counters that's getting put on. The Hydra enters with X +1/+1 counters, but it doesn't double it, does it?
No, it only doubles it when it's triggered. So if it enters with that many counters, that isn't a triggered ability. I don't think there's enough stuff right now, for the most part, to take advantage of Panharmonicon.
Yeah. You mentioned it when you went through the list. Eldrazi Monument, great in the current build of the deck because there are so many bodies, and some of these bodies make tokens and whatnot. But in the build I'm viewing in my head, you don't really want to sacrifice a 12/12 Hydra to keep the other 8/8 Hydra alive in the air.
There's not a ton of cannon fodder in this deck to sacrifice to Eldrazi Monument. There's some, but I feel like I would rather just kill everybody with another overrun kind of effect.
Yes, but
because most of the time what this is doing is giving yourself evasion and making it stronger. And yeah, the Indestructible's nice too, but you're usually not dropping Eldrazi Monument with a plan that's going to stick around for 4 turns. You're usually dropping it and planning on doing some damage that turn, and I feel like in this kind of deck, I would rather just run an overrun. Or even something like Biomass Mutation that's going to make all your creatures +X/+X, but they're going to keep, their trample abilities, that kind of thing. So, and their +1 counters will stack. Like, one of the problems with Biomass Mutation is creatures become XX with whatever you pump into it. If you're playing in Hydras in this kind of deck where they have +1 counters, making those 0/0s into something else is not a bad thing because the counters will then go on top of whatever you turn them into. So there's a couple of other things I think you could do that do a better job of what Eldrazi Monument does. Everflowing Chalice, similarly, I guess it's the kind of thing you could cast because maybe you have a ton of mana from Kruphix and you need to dump it into something. Yeah, it's it's a target, though, to be removed pretty easily, and I just feel like I would rather use one of the 2 mana land ramp spells we talked about, Nature's Lore, in that slot or something instead of Everflowing Chalice. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense to me. I'm overall not a fan of this card in general, so but
no, I do like it. I do like it, but I don't know if I like it here.
Okay.
Great Henge. This is a kind of a great deck for Great Henge.
Yeah.
So +1 counter synergy, gives you a little life gain, draws you cards. It's going to be cheap to cast because some of your bodies are big. Basilisk Collar.
Love it.
It is a really efficient way to give you that big life. Like if you swing with a 14/14 with Death Touch, the life gain from that is oftentimes going to be the kind of thing that puts you out of dying range.
Oh, for sure. Especially if something has trample. Then you just assign a single point of damage and then you bust
carried
the
over.
Rest. Yep.
Yeah, I kind of tend to agree. It's not the kind of card you usually see in this kind of deck, but I think it probably is pretty effective here.
Yeah.
The Ozolith, or Ozolith, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, is a new card that we got in... Was it in Ikoria?
No, it'll be in Ikoria, yes.
In a Core, okay. So it's 1 mana, and whenever a creature you control leaves the battlefield, if it had counters on it, put those counters on the Ozolith. And at the beginning of combat on your turn, if the Ozolith has counters on it, you may move all of the counters from the Ozolith onto target creature.
I definitely agree this will be great in this deck, and the deck I'm envisioning where I would take this.
Yes.
The one thing you got to remember is it's all counters. It's not pick or choose. It's everything.
So those -1 counters or something can get moved over as well.
Yes.
Negative ones can get bumped over. But the fact that it says leaves the battlefield is huge, because Taylor mentioned there's a lot of a lot of exile removal in this meta. Ozolith doesn't care. If they exile your Hydra, those counters still get moved over, whether it's exiled or bounced to your hand or just destroyed. And oftentimes these kind of effects just care about being destroyed. Not this one. It's leaves the battlefield. So it's going to preserve those counters unless they deal with the Ozolith. That card is crazy for 1 mana.
Super crazy. It's so good. So good.
That's one I would absolutely like. If I was to make one, if you told me I could make one change to this deck, it would probably be adding that 1 card.
Okie dokie.
Last but not least here, Max, should we look at creatures?
Yeah.
33 creatures in this deck.
34 if we count Nyx Bloom.
Yes, that's true. Yeah, that's a lot.
And
I don't think in a creature-based deck that makes sense. Is it too many? What are your thoughts?
I think it's too many. I think it's not focused. This creature suite is not focused. So
and that's kind of a problem with the deck as a whole. A little bit. There's a lot of kind of scattershot things going on, but the creature suite especially is where you see it at.
So Taylor's note said this was a Hydra deck. I think there are only 6 Hydras in the entire deck.
I believe yes, I think that's correct.
So that to me doesn't scream Hydra deck. Like, I'm kind of a purist like you. When it's something tribal, I want as many as I can put in that deck that are
Sure.
worthwhile. So we'll go through the list quick, and then I have a lot to say. So Astra of the Endless Web. This was from Theros Beyond Death. It's the spider with reach, and when your opponents cast an instant or sorcery spell, create a 1/2 spider token with reach. We have a couple Eldrazi in Artisan of Kozilek and Bane of Bala Ged. We also have an Endbringer and a Void Winnower, so they are a bunch of Eldrazi. We also have the Crater Hoof Behemoth for a nice finisher.
Yep.
Deep Glow Skate to enter to double any counters on stuff. We have a Dryad of the Elysian Grove, just a mana fixer and a way to play an additional land every turn. We have a handful of mana dorks with Elvish Mystic, Gyre Sage, Llanowar Elves, and Priest of Titania. And along with Rishkar, Prima Renegade. They're all mana dorks. Rishkar at least does some +1/+1 counter stuff, so I'm okay with that one. We also have just some overall good cards in like Eternal Witness, Master Biomancer, Nadir Kraken, Nessian Boar, Seedborn Muse, Siege Behemoth, Splitting Slime, Tatiova, Thassa Deep Dwelling, Pirantuthi, like we mentioned, Vorel of the Hullclade, Wonder, and then the Hangerback Walker I think we mentioned earlier.
Mm-hmm.
So that is the majority of the creature suite in this deck.
I feel like so one of the things I don't know if I've ever even said it out loud or if I've just thought it in my head. I feel like decks that are running more than 26, 25, 27-ish creatures or whatever, I feel like you need to have some added reason you have so many creatures in your deck, or it just suggests that the person it's asking you to overextend into a board wipe. Now, there's reasons it's worth doing that if your deck is running a bunch of, I mentioned Working Predators before, if you're running a bunch of effects like that, where like you're going to be doing things with all those creatures that you have in your library, so the density matters, or like the new Winetta in Ikoria that cares about the top 6 cards of your library being creatures, and you're going to get multiple triggers off that. You want to have a density of creatures to get as many of those as possible out. Shadowborn Apostles or Rats or something, you need to have so many of those in your deck or whatever. So if you have a reason to have 1/3 of your deck be creatures, then that's fine. But if you don't, I think it's the kind of thing that kind of makes you want to put too many bodies down that you're just going to lose to the first board wipe. And I feel like that's the case here. I feel like there's a lot of creatures here that are perfectly fine, but they are going to get killed on turn 6 when someone drops that first Day of Judgment, and then you are going to find yourself behind and having a tough time catching back up.
Okay.
I would just thin that out. We offered some suggestions here before. Some of those can be added in by taking some creatures out. The main thing I would do, though, before anything else, is I would just pull out some of these creatures and replace them with draw things we suggested, whether it's Return of the Wild Speaker or even something boring like Harmonize or, Chart a Course or something, which I didn't even suggest as a sorcery, but like that's going to stop that from happening. Even if you just dropped from 33 creatures down to 28 creatures and put in 5 different ways to draw cards, that's going to immediately make it so much easier to bounce back from that board wipe when you turn one of those slots that would be a body that goes away into a thing that puts 4 cards into your hand. It's just going to make dealing with a downturn that much easier. So that's my main thought on the creatures here is not even like necessarily individual bodies so much as it is just run a few less and run a few more draw spells.
Okay.
What do you have for us here?
As we mentioned, the creature suite is pretty scattered. A lot of different things going on, and the fact that this was meant to be a Hydra deck, I would really lean into that. So I would, when you look at the list, there's 4 Hydras, a bunch of Mana Dorks, there's the +1/+1 counter stuff, and then just some general good stuff in Simic like Seedborn Muse, Craterhoof, Tatiova. I would focus this creature suite down to Hydras and then the +1/+1 counter support. That would be removing the Eldrazi,
Yeah, Eldrazi especially, some of them are, number one, Endbringer is kind of difficult to cast in this deck. It's definitely difficult to have 2 colorless mana to activate that draw card ability on it, and it doesn't really synergize that much. Well, I guess that's not true because of Kruphix.
Right. So I get why they're in here, I just don't think they play well with what the original goal of the deck was.
Yeah, no, for sure.
And then there are a bunch of good Hydras out there that are reasonably monetarily cheap and are awesome to play with. The one exception is Hydroid Krasis. That would be the first card I put in this deck. I think yours was Ozolith. My first one would be Hydroid Krasis. It draws you cards, gains you life, and comes in with a bunch of counters on it.
Yeah.
But you also have stuff like Mana Gorger Hydra, which just gets bigger when people play the game.
Yes. Set it and forget it, and it gets huge.
Voracious Hydra. There's Whiptongue Hydra. It's the bane of my existence, but that's how you deal with a bunch of flyers that your opponents control, and it's going to get bigger.
Yeah.
Uvenwald Hydra helps you ramp, and it just gets bigger based on how many lands you have. Lifeblood Hydra draws you cards and gains you life when it dies.
Lifeblood Hydra has been devastating at times in my Crush deck for my opponents. Just being able to, when they have to be like, okay, I have to choose right now between taking 12 to the face from this Hydra or making you draw 12 cards and gain 12 life, and that's a bad situation no matter what they pick.
Right. And then Gargos should be in this deck if it's a Hydra deck. It's going to reduce all your Hydras by 4, which that can be pumped right into the X cost of your Hydra spells that have them.
Yeah, that's a perfect one as well.
Some of the other +1/+1 counter creatures that could go in this deck, Walking Ballista, there's a nice combo. Altered Ego is a clone, but it has to deal with +1/+1 counters. So clone one of those Hydras. It's going to come in with the counters. And now you have 2 Clonian Hydras, or 2 Uvenwald Hydras, or 2 Hydroid Krasises. You won't get the ability from Hydroid Krasis, but you're going to have 2 of them.
Right.
Stonecoil Serpent is just a snake from, I believe, Throne of Eldraine, but it has protection from multicolored. So that's a lot of commanders are multicolored out there. So you can punch through, a commander if you need to.
Yep.
Evolution Sage is great whenever you play a land, proliferate.
Yeah, I like that also in this deck, maybe better than some of the Mana Dorks that are currently here.
The one Mana Dork I would keep would be Gyre Sage, just because that's going to get out of control quickly.
Yes. Gyre Sage, when a Gyre Sage blows up, it feels so strong being able to tap that for a gazillion mana. And this is a perfect deck for it when you can keep it with Kruphix every turn, or you even have things like the Helix Pinnacle to put it into. Yeah.
I would keep stuff like Vorel, because that's going to double counters. But I think just since not all Hydras have it, you need some trample enablers. So Nylea, God of the Hunt, and Crowned Ceratok were the first 2 I could come up with. Nylea grants all your creatures trample and also has a built-in